I'm Eric R. Christoph of Hover and Smile. Here's our segment on the Spectrum DX6i transmitter, dual rates and exponential. Our examples tonight, the Blade MSR helicopter and the E-flite 4-site airplane. But first, a dramatic pause. Recall that dual rate was changing with the flick of a switch on your transmitter the amount of servo throw in your aircraft for each of the corresponding channels, rudder, elevator, and ailerons. And exponential changed that curve to not a straight line, but an exponential one, and it numbs the sticks out in the center. If you need more detail than that, please see our first video on dual rate and exponential theory. That being said, here is the DX6i. We've got numerous switches here up on top. One of the first things you might want to ask yourself as you set up your dual rate or exponential is if you want to have specific control over each channel individually with your flick of your switch, or if you want to use one switch. The DX6i will support both. So if you've got your elevator switch here, your aileron switch here, and your rudder switch here, you can control the dual rate and exponential for each of those specifically. So if I only want to change the dual rate of my rudder, I would just flick this switch here in the back or whichever channel I wanted to change. If you want to have control of all three, and this corresponds with using stunt mode, that's this mode here, flight mode. You can set up your dual rate so that with flicking one switch, you change all three channel rates and exponential for your aircraft. It's all up to you and what you prefer. I personally, at this point in my flying game, I like to have one switch to rule them all, one switch to bind them. So if I have stunt mode off and flight mode being 0, I'm just in my normal rate. Maybe it's a little low, maybe it's high, it doesn't really matter. It's just the rate that I'm normally flying in. And then if I want to change my dual rates to some other mode, say to have a little bit more control or less, I flick that switch up. Usually, when flight mode is in 1, that's usually more of a stunt mode. So if anything, maybe 1 is your high rate and 0 is your low rates. It doesn't really matter as long as you set your transmitter up properly for each of the positions of your switches. So with one flick of a switch, I could have my rudder, aileron, and elevator all set up on the same rate. We're going to go with the one switch mechanism, but we're going to cover how you change that in the menus here. So let's get started with dual rate and exponential with the E-flite Blade MSR helicopter. Here we have our Spectrum DX6i transmitter, and we already have our slot set up for the MSR. Now, in this example, we're going to use one switch to rule all of the rates for the channels. Each channel can have its own rate, but one switch will flip between high and low rate for all three channels. You can use individual ones if you'd like. Here's how you switch between individual switches per channel rates and one switch for all channel rates. Simply click into your menu. If you're in the adjust list, you want to go to setup list. Scroll down until you see DR Combi, short for dual rate combining. Right now it's on INH, which means it's inhibited. Each channel controls its own individual dual rate. We're going to set this not to aileron, elevator, rudder, but to FM for flight mode, this switch up here, currently set in the 0 position. Select that, go back to your menu, scroll back down, we'll go to the adjust list. This is where the dual rate option is. Scroll down to the dual rate and Expo option, select it. You can see the dual rates currently are default at 0 as my low rate, 100%, and inhibit, which means no exponential. For each of these three channels, I can then switch to the other rate, rate 1, with just the flick of that one switch, as so. You can see where the numbers change from 0 to 1. So let's go back to mode 0, which will be our low rates. And to set any of the rates, you simply click in and scroll to your desired rate. For example, we'll just make this a docile flyer. We'll choose the 60% rate. We won't use any expo for the hovering, but we'll put some expo on the rudder just to kind of show you what it feels like. So we're at 60% for aileron and elevator, which is these controls here. We're keeping them the same so that it's a stable flight across the board and very docile. Now we'll scroll down to rudder. I'll set that to, say, 65. And to set Expo, you scroll over into this column and scroll up for a positive number. Some transmitters are different. Spectrum uses positive Expo to perform the type of Expo functions we're doing here. But for example, Futaba uses a negative Expo. So make sure you just know which number direction you should go based on your manual. But for Spectrum, it's positive. So we'll set this up to about 35% Expo. And now in low rate, this is what our setting is. 60% of normal servo throw for aileron and elevator, 65% for rudder, and 35% Expo. If I flick the switch up, I'll be in the high rate, and you can see it goes right all to 100%, and it inhibited, no exponential. That's how you switch back and forth. Now, one of the ways that you can kind of see this in action is to scroll all the way back up and go back to your setup list. There's an option called Monitor, which lets you see the movements of your sticks. So if I move the stick left and right, you can see that the appropriate channel is also moving. I'll move it to the very extreme here so you can see that the two arrows here have moved all the way to the right, or I'm sorry, the left. And if I flick the dual rate switch up to high rate, you'll see those just jumped because now I'm at 100% of my throw. Back to the low rate, now the high rate. So you can use the monitor to even tell if the right channel is acting as it should based on your rate setup. Very nice and easy way. Same with the rudder, works the same way. I'll flick the switch, and you can see it jump, and then now jump back to its low rate. Now we don't necessarily have a different setting for the foresight, but let's take a look and assume that we put a very similar dual rate setup, and with the foresight you'll be able to really see the movements and be able to tell when I'm in the high rate and when I'm in the low rate, besides looking at the monitor. All right, let's look at the rate that we have set up for the foresight. If I scroll into the adjust list and go into the dual rate and Expo, I'm now using individual switches just for the example. So you can see when I flick elevator from 0 to 1, I'm in my high rate and I've added 60% Expo. That's just for visual purposes. I wouldn't necessarily fly it like this at all. This is to show you that you can set it differently for each of the rates, and that when I change the elevator movement, that Expo will make it very numb around this area. But as soon as I extend all the way down to my endpoint, it'll go the 100% throw. If I flick back to 0, I'm only on 30% throw for all of my channels. The other channels in high rate are 100% with no Expo. So let's go all the way to the low rate, and then let's take a look at the plane as I flick the switches, and you'll see the changes in the control surfaces. Okay, so here's the example of that foresight movement. We've got everything in the low rate mode, and you can see as I move my elevator around, you can see it's moving here. The aileron movement is there, and rudder movement is there. Now, watch the elevator because I'm going to flick it up into the high rate mode, and you can see that when I flick it, the throw goes from that low 30% we gave it all the way to 100%, and you can see how it immediately goes to its max throw. And now I'm moving it up and down all the full range. But now I've got that Expo on there, so as I move my stick up and down just around the outside, you can see it's barely moving, barely being nudged by the movement of the control stick. But when I reach the final end position, that Expo curve kicks in and I'm at my full throw. So you can see where it just pauses and really becomes numb around the center of the stick when I'm moving my aileron. And since I now can flick to the high rate for the aileron and rudder, you can really see the difference in the movement. I'll go back to the low rate for the aileron by flicking my switch. You can see where now the control surfaces move much less. The flight will be very docile. Okay, here's our Blade MSR and our dual rate switch set up on the flight mode switch on the DX6i. That covers all three channels with one switch flick. Switch position 0 is 60% or so rate on all three channels and 35% Expo on the rudder. Position 1, 100% rate on all three channels and 0 exponential. Now, small disclaimer, I'm going to try to fly this while talking on the camera, and the Blade MSR here I have, he's been beaten up a little bit, but we'll give it a shot. Bringing him up in the low rate mode, so that's flight position switch 0 on the flight mode. Moves around a little bit, but you can kind of tell that he's really not moving around that fast. He'll move if I keep him in one position, but it'll take a while for him to get there. And the rotation on the helicopter, that's about as fast as the rudder rotates. Now I'll bring him up to the high rate, and we'll see I've got a lot more movement. I can swing him back and forth across the entire camera with ease. And as far as the rudder control, you can now see he spins a lot faster than he did before. So that, in essence, is how dual rate and exponential works. With just the flick of a switch on your transmitter, flicking him back to low rate, he's now very docile again, doesn't really want to move around a lot, and much easier to fly. So have fun with experimenting with some values that you like to use to fly, and just make sure you know what rate you're in. I'm Eric R. Christoph of Hover and Smile. This is Dual Rate and Exponential with Spectrum DX6i transmitter with the E-flite Blade MSR and the Foresight airplane. Thanks for watching.